case we will be using for this particular build is the Phanteks M2 Pro. We will start out by unscrewing the two side panels, that way we can access the inside of the case. This way we can insert all the new components for our new build. I would advise keeping the plastic on top of the glass during the build, that way if you do move the panel or lay it down anywhere, you avoid having any scratches or fingerprints on that new glass. The M2 Pro case comes with the shield that goes on top of the power supply that is located on the bottom of the case. On the back side, however, there are 3 screws that keep this in place, so the next step is to unscrew this and take out the shield. That way it's easier to install the power supply later on. Use the manual to locate where these screws are and also where the power supply will go in later on. Next, we'll go ahead and lower the case and put it on its side on top of a table surface or hard surface. Try to avoid using carpet during a build, that way you avoid static electricity for your new computer parts. Next, we'll go ahead and take out the M.2 screws, as well as the cables we'll need for our hard drives later on. These are located inside the motherboard box. In this case, I will be using the MSI MPG X570 Gaming Pro Carbon Wi-Fi that will be used for the AMD Ryzen 3000 series processor. We'll go ahead and close the box back up, and we'll use it as a surface for the motherboard. That way we avoid, again, static electricity later on, and also avoid having the pins on the bottom of the motherboard touching a hard surface such as a table. So we'll keep the plastic on it for now. We'll place it on top of the motherboard box. Next, we'll go ahead and unwrap the motherboard. Might have to use some scissors depending upon the wrapping. So we'll carefully lay it on the other side, get some scissors, cut open the tab there, and we'll go ahead and lay that motherboard on top of the box. Next, we'll go ahead and remove some of the plastic that comes on top of the motherboard when you receive it. This way we don't forget it later on, and so you don't have any melted plastic on your new motherboard once it starts to heat up once it's already installed. The last piece of plastic in this case for this motherboard is a little difficult due to its shape. So if you're going to use this motherboard, make sure you carefully find the area where you can peel it off and then slowly peel it off because of its weird shape. Next, we'll go ahead and remove the CPU from the box. AMD Ryzen processors comes with a cooler already in there, and it also comes with thermal paste, so keep that in mind if you're going to be using this cooler. In this case, I will not, but I'm going to go ahead and remove it, put it aside, and I'm going to pull out the new Ryzen 3700X processor. Next, locate the triangle on your CPU socket. This will match up with the triangle on the bottom corner of your CPU. In this case, the Ryzen. The Ryzen also comes with different pins on the bottom, unlike Intel. However, it's mostly similar when you are installing it into the CPU socket, and make sure you grab the CPU on the sides, not touching the thermal header as well as the pins on the bottom. You might want to give a little jiggle just to make sure it's firmly in place, but if it's already in there, it should be pretty good. Next, use the lever, and it'll be a little bit of tension, but don't freak out and put that in place. Next, we'll go ahead and lower the clasp for the RAM sockets. In this case, I'm having 64 gigabytes of RAM, a full install, so I'm going to do all 4 on each side. When inserting the RAM cartridges, it's important to keep in mind that these go in only one way. They are not symmetrical. In that case, line up the hole on the bottom of your RAM cartridge with the hole on the RAM socket. That way it can slide just in and not damage any part of the RAM cartridge or of the socket. When you insert it, you may have to put a little bit of pressure to get it down into its spot, however not too much force. You might want to put your 2 thumbs on the outer edge of the cartridge and then press down firmly. You should hear a nice click as the clamps come down and keep the cartridge in place. You'll repeat this process for the other sticks of RAM that you'll be installing. However, if you're only installing 2 sticks, please consult your manual to see which slot you put in first and then follow behind that. If you're doing all 4, you can simply just put them all in 1, 2, 3, 4. We are about to move on to the M.2 hard drive installation. But before we get too far into that, I want to share a key piece of information that may help you with your current build regarding your motherboard and an M.2 heat shield. For an ATX build, most cases should come with 9 pre-installed standoffs. These 9 standoffs should line up with 9 screw holes on your ATX motherboard. This particular motherboard, the X570, you can see those 9 screw holes here. Also notice that the M.2 heat shield on this motherboard lines up pretty well with one of the middle screw holes. Unfortunately, I did not notice this in time, so when I installed the motherboard, I only kept 8 screws in versus all 9, just so I made sure I didn't have one screw rubbing against the motherboard inside the case. So if you're going to be using this motherboard, make sure you install the M.2 after you put the motherboard in. That way you can install all 9 screws in safely and then put the M.2 after that. It's important to note that this particular X570 motherboard, the screw on the heat shield on the left hand side is actually going to be used to keep the hard drive in place once we install the M.2 drive. So in this case, if you're going to remove the M.2 screws, keep them just in case, but for this particular build we're not going to end up using them. So there's no point in ripping open the bag or anything like that and having extra screws. Just keep those inside the motherboard box if you're not going to be using them. So first step will be to remove this thermal shield. Using the screws that are already in there, use a screwdriver and unscrew these. Once the thermal shield is removed, now we can see that on this motherboard you have the socket for the screw that we just removed, as well as a middle screw. If you consult the manual, especially for this motherboard, it mentions to remove this screw so it doesn't cause any damage to the hard drive once it's in motion. So we're going to go ahead and remove this middle screw to follow the manual. You'll want to consult your own manual for any particular motherboard you are using if there is a screw here and a thermal shield involved. Once we have removed that middle screw that the motherboard manual mentioned, it's time to insert the hard drive. You'll want to come in about a 30-degree angle, and it should stick right in the slot, no problem. Maybe a little bit of pressure, but not too much. When it comes to installing the heat shield on top of the M.2 drive, go ahead and remove the plastic that's on top of the thermal pad. This will allow you to put the thermal on top of your M.2 drive. Once we start to screw it into the motherboard, remember that screw on the left hand side. Line this up with that screw hole on your motherboard. It may help to have an extra set of hands to hold down your M.2 drive onto your motherboard. That way you can kind of line up your thermal pad without fearing that it's going to touch your M.2 too soon. Once you get that left hand screw in there, the other two should line up just fine. As mentioned previously, I will not be using the AMD Wraith cooler that comes with the processor. Instead, I will be using the Noctua NH-U14S. So I'm going to go ahead and get that out of the box, get some boxes removed, and prepare it for installation. For AMD builds, most motherboards will already come with brackets installed onto your motherboard. Since I'm not using the Wraith cooler, I'm going to take out these brackets and get ready to put my own in for the Noctua cooler. If you're using the Wraith cooler, make sure you consult the manual because you may actually not have to remove any of the brackets because it should line up with the brackets already installed. The Noctua cooler comes with some washers available that will serve where your screws are going to go inside your motherboard. So I'm going to put all 4 of those in their appropriate places. Once those washers are in place, I'm going to go ahead and start to screw in those brackets for the Noctua air cooler. When installing the brackets for the cooler, you're going to want to bend them outwards away from the CPU. To get a better handle on this, follow your manual for your cooler, that way you can understand which direction they should be facing once you're installing it. Something very important for a computer build is having that thermal paste that will go in between your cooler and your CPU. The Noctua air cooler already came with thermal paste in the box, so I did not need to purchase any other thermal paste, but I still had to apply this one. You may want to actually apply it to another surface just to get some practice with it, but a good rule of thumb is the pea size or a grain of rice, a very small dot that goes on the middle of your CPU, because once your cooler comes in contact with the CPU, it kind of spreads this paste across that thermal header. Your Noctua air cooler may come with the fan already installed onto the heatsink like mine did. In that case, follow the manual and remove that fan. I have already done so, so I will go ahead and start installing that heatsink. Notice the two big screws will line up with the longer headers that were on top of the bracket that we just installed. You may want to follow the rule of thumb of doing about halfway on one side and then the other half on the other side. That way once your cooler meets the thermal header on your CPU, it evenly balances out that thermal paste versus having one side elongated than the other when you're screwing the two screws in. For putting the fan back onto the heatsink, make sure you follow the manual or remember how you took it off of the heatsink when you first got the cooler. You'll see these little two ends on the edge of the fan have circled here, and they'll line up with the openings on the heatsink. That way they slide just in, but make sure you line up your fan with the edge or top of your cooler based upon the height you want above your RAM down towards the bottom. While your motherboard is still out of the case, if you refer to your manual, most Noctua manuals will suggest going ahead to plug in the cable that will power up your fan into the correct socket on your motherboard. So refer to not only your Noctua manual but also your motherboard manual in which slot to plug in that cable. That way it's ready to go once you've already installed your motherboard into the case. When installing the motherboard into the case, the first step is making sure the I/O shield or your input-output shield on the side of your motherboard gets installed first. Most motherboards have this. However, my motherboard already had the I/O shield installed onto the motherboard, so I did not have to worry about putting in the shield first and then putting in the motherboard. So I went ahead and lined up that I/O shield with the opening on the side of the case, and it kind of slid in. It took me a little bit of time, but it slid right in. And also remember those 9 standoffs? Those screw holes on your motherboard should line up just fine with those standoffs, and it should slide just in. After that, I went ahead and made sure that the fan did not stick outside of the case, so I went ahead and put the side panel with the glass on top of it, just to lay it on top to make sure it did not rub up against the case, and I didn't need to lower the fan further down on the heatsink. Once the motherboard is in place and that I/O shield lining up with the outside of the case, it's time to put in those 9 screws that will securely fasten the motherboard to the case. For this build, I have an EVGA Supernova power supply. With the cables involved, one side will actually have G3 located on it for your CPU connectors, your motherboard connectors, as well as your SATA connectors. This will plug into the side on the power supply. The other end will plug into your motherboard, your CPU connector on the motherboard, and your hard drives. I will go ahead and plug in one SATA cable on this power supply, as we'll see later on the other end of your SATA cables inside your power supply box. At least for this EVGA power supply, there's actually 3 headers on the opposite side that are kind of connected together. It's very weird, but only one SATA connector will be needed in this build since I'm only installing 2 other hard drives that are not M.2 in nature. With the case now lifted back up off its side, I will go ahead and put in the power supply inside of the case, just so I can go ahead and run the cables to the back side of the case for cable management later on. It just makes it a little bit easier to go ahead and do it now without the power supply shroud on top of it and without other cables being plugged into the motherboard just yet. I would advise keeping the PSU shroud off of the power supply for now. This way, once you're ready to install your video card later in the build, it's easier to plug in those power cables for your video card. Screwing in your power supply can be a little bit difficult depending upon your case. In this instance, I actually had to lift the power supply up off the surface with one hand while screwing in with the other. Also, my screw holes were asymmetrical. They weren't in a square shape like most cases are. So in your case, make sure you analyze your computer case and your power supply to know where the screw holes are. Maybe look at the manual a couple times. That way you know exactly where to screw in those screws. If there's any tension with your screws or if they're going in a little bit too easily, it's possible that they're going into the wrong holes. They should catch on to the holes just right and they should fit in. It's just about time to start plugging in some of those connectors on the motherboard. I will start out with the USB 2.0 header that comes with the case, as well as the audio connector. Make sure you consult your manual for your motherboard to make sure you're plugging it in to the right spot on your motherboard. The 6 hard drive bays come in 2 cartridges in the Noctua Pro case. They are screwed into it, however they are easily removable, so I'm going to go ahead and remove both of these cartridges just so it's easier for me to be able to maneuver the cables for the USB 3.0 connector, as well as the power supply connectors later on for both the hard drives and also going into the motherboard. I will continue to keep running cables for other connectors as well as other power cables on the back side of the case. You'll also notice here that I did run the power connector for the CPU before I plugged it into the motherboard. I would actually advise doing it the opposite way, especially if your power connector is towards the top of the case. It just makes it easier to plug in those power connectors and then run it back to your power supply a little bit later on. You'll also notice that my motherboard has a 12-pin power connector. With the EVGA power supply, it only comes with two 4x4s, meaning that there's two 4-pin connectors that combine to make 8, which make a total of 16. In this case, thankfully, the N3 Pro case had a little slot that allowed me to Velcro tie the other 4-pin connector to the case without it hanging off the edge or rattling against anything else. So make sure you consult your manual and as well as your power supply to make sure you won't have any loose hanging cables, and you can easily zip tie it to something else if it is going to be loosely hanging. With the N3 Pro case, there were a few single pin connectors for like LED switches, plus or minus. I went ahead and plugged these into the motherboard. I had to consult the manual to make sure I found out which way they went in. Yes, they do go into specific connectors. So make sure you consult your manual if you have any of these LED connectors in your case. When inserting the USB 3.0 header, it can be fairly difficult since the pins can bend fairly easily. I had to take the top of the N3 Pro case off so I could have a better visual aid to see where this connector went in on the motherboard. It took me a few tries to get it in there and not too much force as well. Too much force can bend the pins. So be very careful when inserting this USB 3.0 header. I'll go ahead and plug in the power connector for the motherboard, the 24-pin connector. It took a little bit of force to put it in there and a few tries to make sure it was in securely, but it should snap right in. I will be installing two Samsung SSDs, the 860 Pro as well as the 860 EVO. Since these are SSDs and all I really have left are those 3.5-inch bay cartridges, I will screw these in from the bottom using the screws that were inside the box and put those into the bay cartridges. Again, these screws are going to be located in your case if it comes with it. Make sure you consult the manual to make sure you have the right screws. Also, if you have a 3.5-inch hard drive that you're going to be installing, it may go in a little bit differently since it's made to fit this particular cartridge. So make sure you follow all the manuals that are needed when installing your hard drives. The N3 Pro case makes it fairly easy to slide those bay cartridges into the main slot. Once those are in place, I will put that 3-slot cartridge back into the case and screw it in and get ready to plug in the SATA connector and the power cable from the power supply into the two hard drives. Okay, so now the two data connectors that came with your motherboard box, you'll take those out and start to plug those into both of the hard drives or however many hard drives you're putting into your case. You'll remember that we mentioned the 3 headers that were on the SATA power connector from the power supply. It took me a few tries to figure out the best way to plug these into the 2 hard drives without having too much of a hanging cable. So make sure if you're using any particular power supply with a 3 header, give it a little test and see exactly the way you want to put those connectors there so you don't have any loosely hanging cables that are too obvious. Back to the front of the case we go, and I will plug in those 2 data connectors into the motherboard. We are getting pretty close to the end of the build, so it's time to start putting in that video card. My case has 8 PCIe slots on the back side of the case. I will go ahead and unscrew the one directly beneath the topmost PCIe slot and the one directly beneath that second slot. Those 2 should come out, and that will be where the video card will go. You may want to line up your video card first with your motherboard to make sure you unscrew those 2 slots that line up directly horizontally with your video card. In most cases, it's usually the second and third slot, even if you only have 7 and not 8 PCIe expansion slots. Unfortunately, when I installed the video card, I stood in front of the camera, so I couldn't give you much of a shot when I installed it. But overall, there should be a little bit of a slot between a smaller area and a larger area for your connector on your video card. This should line up with your motherboard, and it should slot right in, not too much pressure, should stick right in. Go ahead and take those screws and put the brackets back on the PCIe slots to securely fasten your video card. My video card, the MSI GeForce RTX 2060 Gaming Z, came with plastic on the side, so I'm going to go ahead and remove that before I turn the computer on. When it comes to plugging in the video card, honestly it comes down to personal preference. In this case, I used the 6-pin by 2-pin on the VGA cable and plugged that into the video card. The other end I did into the power supply. I also kept the power supply shroud off in this case, so I could put that end in the power supply first, then put the shroud back on, and then kind of figure out how I wanted to put the cable, either on the little opening that points outward from the case, or just put it through the other edge that's kind of facing on the inward side of the case. I selected not to go through that little opening. Well, that just about wraps up this build video. I'm not really going to post the cable management part of it. I'm going to basically say it took me a few hours to do it. So if you want your cables to look nice, I definitely encourage you to take your time and mess around with the cables to see exactly the way you want to run it through your case and into different parts of the CPU. So make sure you take your time and make it look nice. Again, if you're spending all this time building a nice new computer, you want to make sure all of it looks pretty good before putting on those side panels. Overall, I'm very pleased with how this build turned out. I wanted to be able to get a faster computer to handle rendering inside of Adobe After Effects. That's mainly what I'm going to be using this for, a lot of animation, some visual effects on the green screen, some stuff. So I want to be able to have a computer that handled it with more RAM, faster CPU, a newer CPU, and overall, I'm going to be posting the benchmarks here pretty soon on the end of this video, but it seems to be living up to its name and running fairly smoothly. Thank the Lord, there's no problem so far. Hopefully it stays that way. I like the way it's running. The LEDs were a nice subtle touch to this system, but overall seems to be running pretty well. Hopefully this video helped you out, especially for the beginner builders. Remember, this is my first build, but I wanted to be able to post all the parts that I'm using, which are also in the description below for any beginner builders. Remember, everyone uses a computer differently. Some game, some use it just for regular purposes, and in my case, use it for Adobe After Effects. So everyone uses it differently. You can use different parts. So these are the parts that I'm using. And again, if you want more info on computer building, you may want to check out some other YouTubers out there that have had more time and experience building some builds. But overall, hopefully this allows you to see some things that you might run into as a beginner builder, and hopefully it helps you out with your upcoming build.